There's my good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our weekly Bible study. I trust you're enjoying the little warmer weather we just had the last couple of days. That's been great. Of course, we got the rain that comes with it, but that's all right. I don't know, we need a lot more rain, but it's always great to have the rain because there's parts of the world that desperately need the rain. So let's be grateful for what we do have. Let me try something. I'm making sure my PowerPoint's moving and there. Okay. Let me ask you a question as we start today. Have you ever had a big event? And it may have been like for Christmas or for Thanksgiving, this huge event. What was it like the week after the big event? Yeah. I think most of us have this incredible letdown. There's this adrenaline rush of preparation. I know in our household, Judy starts preparing for Christmas about Labor Day. She starts thinking about it, and then she starts planning in earnest as we move through the fall season. And so by the time it comes, number one, things never go the way you plan them. Never meet the expectations you have. And third, after it's done and everyone leaves and we wave goodbye to them, there is this incredible letdown. Well, that's what we're going to see happen today in the life of Elijah. Someone who's been preparing for 3+ years for a great event, which we talked about the last couple of weeks. That event takes place, and all of a sudden he has basically an emotional meltdown because of what happens afterwards. But before we do that, let's do a quick review for those who haven't been with us the last couple of weeks. So let's get right into it. So as we look at the life of Elijah, it really kind of begins when Elijah is called by God to confront Ahab. Ahab and his wife had led the people, the northern kingdom, into Baal worship. Things had been bad before, but now things were much, much worse. And so the word that came through Elijah was, it's not going to rain. There's not going to be any heavy dew until I say so. So there was no really end time here. We know from the story that we have reported to us that it happened 3+ years. So in other words, what Elijah basically saying to Ahab, hey, listen, you've been turning your back on God. We're going to find out how strong your God is. And if you want rain, then you got to go to Baal. Now that's going to culminate in a big contest, but that's really what God is saying through the prophet was, you don't want to trust me? You don't want to look to me? Then fine. Experience a drought, which attacked the very nature of one of the Baal gods, who was all about the crops and bringing them in. Because if you got drought, you don't have crops. So the first year, right after that confrontation, Elijah goes into hiding. God takes him to the east of the Jordan River, and for about a year, he's fed by the water that is flowing down the little ravine, and the ravens are bringing bread that he eats. But the day comes, because the drought is continuing, that there's no more water. And so now he moves, and God directs him to move to an area near Sidon. Sidon is Jezebel's hometown. Again, this is not in country, it's still out of country. Why? Because Elijah's wanted. They got a wanted poster out. You find Elijah, bring him to me. He's dead meat, and we're going to take care of this guy. So Elijah has been in hiding for a year. Now he traverses the country and he goes into the neighboring area outside the country. And who takes care of him? Well, the ravens were before, and now we got an impoverished widow. Now there's an interesting, we're going to jump from the pan into the fire itself. So we got an impoverished woman who's about ready to eat her last meal. And of course, the story as we shared with it is Elijah says, yes, God's going to provide, but take care, feed me first. And that wasn't because Elijah was so arrogant. He knew that to teach the lady to trust God, you needed to be able to trust God when it doesn't always make sense. That did not make sense. And yet, if this widow was going to be sustained by God, she had to trust the words of the prophet. And of course, we know she did. And for the next 2 years, God miraculously provides every day just enough oil, just enough meal for the food for that day, kind of like Israel had experience about the manna when they were traveling in the wilderness. Now, we know the story that during these 2 years, the son passes away. And of course, at this point, the prophet is devastated. The mother obviously is overwhelmingly devastated because this is her life. This is her future. There was no safety net. That boy was going to be the one that takes care of her in her old age. Now we get this idea that she is really old in the story. The chances are she's actually a young widow. She probably is in maybe her 20s or 30s when Elijah first comes. So we're talking about a person probably younger than 40. Now, she could have been older, but more than likely she's not, because we know the boy is small enough and young enough that Elijah is able to carry him up and down some stairs. Okay, so he's not having to carry a man, a grown man. He's carrying probably a lad at best. And so this is her future. This is not just emotional attachment. This is actually her physical attachment, because the family took care of the widows, took care of their grandmothers and their parents. And so Elijah comes and God miraculously performs a miracle and raises the son from the dead. At that point, it kind of ends that 2-year period that Elijah has been staying with this widow. And so now a total of 3+ years have passed since Elijah first confronted Ahab, and now he goes and he confronts Ahab again. Okay. And he tells Ahab that the people need to make a decision here. I know you've already made a decision. You're into the Baal camp, but the people need to decide who are they going to choose. And so he gives a challenge to Ahab to have all the priests of Baal, about 850, meet on the top of Mount Carmel. Again, as I've said before, Carmel is not a one mountain. It's actually a mountain range that goes right up to the Mediterranean Sea. And modern day Carmel there's a city called Haifa, which is a port city, one of the major port cities for Israel today. I've actually been there because Phillips had a facility in Haifa, and I visited on 2 different occasions. Right there on the coast, beautiful, beautiful view looking out over the Mediterranean Sea from the mountain range that is called Mount Carmel. And there is the test. Now, we talked about the test last week, where the prophets of Baal spent all day pleading for their God to rain down fire to consume their sacrifice. And when it's all said and done, it didn't work. Elijah prays a 23-word prayer. Fire comes down, consumes. At this point, the people say, we now are going to be Jehovah followers. We're going to follow him. The prophets are eliminated, and you think that's the end of the story. But as we said last week, when Elijah went to Ahab 3.5 years earlier, there was no discussion about this contest. What was the issue there? It was about the rain. It was about the rain. And God says it's not going to rain until I say so. Now they win the battle, but there's still no rain. So just because this great victory has taken place, Elijah's not done. The warfare, so to speak, is not done because there's no rain. And so we talked about last time that Elijah 7 times prays to God. And the word there in the Hebrew is there's an intensity. You know, the 23-word prayer is just, oh God, show yourself strong to the people that they may know that you are Jehovah, and perform a great miracle. That's a paraphrase. Boom, there's a great miracle. But now there's an intensity, there's an earnestness, because at the end of the day, this is the issue. This is exactly what God wanted to teach the people. But the fact is, the lesson would not have been learned until the rains came. So Elijah prays for rain. And of course, we know the story that the rains come. So that's where we pick up the story. Now, I got a little map here to help us out with some things that we talked about. Sidon, this is Jezebel way up here at the edge of the top edge of the map. That's Jezebel's hometown, where her dad was the king. He was also a priest. Zarephath, come down here, and I lost my, if you just come down from Sidon, Zarephath, that's where Elijah was hanging out with that widow for 2 years. So it's kind of in the neighborhood here. Then you go further south and you come to that river Kishon and Mount Carmel. There's a mountain range there. Now, again, you probably don't remember this, but Tishbe, Tishbe, that's Elijah's hometown. You see, it's on the east side of the Jordan River. And then under that is the Cherith Brook. That's the ravine. That's the brook that fed Elijah for that 1 year while the ravens were also feeding him. So Mount Carmel has occurred. Now what's going to happen is Elijah is going to run for his life. I'll talk about this in a moment. And where's he going to run to? He's going to run down to Beersheba, which is at the very southern part of the country. It's down in the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. Okay, so it's way, way south. The Negev desert is down there. So this is a fair distance. This probably would have taken him, probably by foot, it would have taken him weeks to get there. You might have been able to do it in a week. So that's kind of the map. Kind of keep that in your head as we're going through the rest of the story. So as I said before, big event, 3+ years in preparation. Now it takes place. The people follow after Jehovah. The rains are coming, and Elijah is exhausted. Okay. So Ahab, I'm trying to get into Ahab's mind, what in the world he was thinking. Because he goes home. All of his priests that he's been supporting and sponsoring and feeding from his household have just been killed. So he goes home and tells his wife what had happened, how Elijah had killed all the prophets. Ahab seems to just take it in stride, doesn't appear to be overly anxious about it. Now, he probably was, but nothing like his wife, who absolutely goes ballistic. She says, if you're not going to do something, hubby, I'm going to. Ladies, have you ever said that to those husbands? If you're not going to do something, I will, right? Sometimes us wives have to do that to us. So Ahab had accepted defeat, but Jezebel did not. She's a fighter. And so she takes matters into her own hands, and she's now out to seek revenge on the prophet. Okay. She doesn't really know how to get back at God, but she knows how to get back at God's people. And so she's going to go after Elijah. So you thought he had a bounty put on his head before. There's a big bounty because now the queen is involved. And when she's involved, people die. This has happened before. Many of the prophets of Jehovah have been killed by Jezebel over the years. And so people did not take her warnings very, very lightly. So she sent a messenger to Elijah to threaten his life. And this intimidates, and Elijah panics. Now, I think under normal circumstance, if he hadn't had just this big event, he probably would have handled this differently. And think about this in your own life. When you and I are well rested and we think clearly, we're able to take the issues of life a little more easier than when we're exhausted, drained, spent. Same event comes and it just wipes us out. And I see this happening with Elijah. Here was a man who had this incredible victory that God had used him to perform these 2 miracles about bringing the rain as well as the fire from heaven. And Elijah is emotionally spent. And then on top of that, the queen is out for your neck. And he panics and he runs. And it says that he ran for his life to Beersheba away from Jezebel. This is the crash. And now we're going to learn, I think, something that I've had to learn several times through my life is when you have these crashes, what you should and should not do. And we're going to learn from God's word what we should do when we have those emotional crashes in our lives. First thing don't do is he separated himself from everybody. He had a servant that went with him. Remember that servant who kept looking to see if there was any rain clouds? And he came back 7 times because he was looking out over the Mediterranean, looking for the rain clouds, because that's where the rain would come from, the Mediterranean Sea. And only on the 7th time did he says, well, it's not much of a cloud, Elijah. It's about the size of a man's hand. Elijah says, run for cover. See, little is much when God is in it, right? And so that servant had been with him. We don't know when he had joined company with Elijah. It doesn't appear that the servant has been with Elijah those 3 years. So is this someone that just as Elijah's finally started coming out, needed some help in terms of things? So this is a servant that's been with him, probably more than likely a short period of time. But it's the only support group he had. And he separates himself from it. So the first thing never to do is isolate yourself from people when you're emotionally drained. And then the second thing he did is he sat alone and he felt sorry for himself. I want to ask how many have done that before. I think we all have, because he was discouraged. He was discouraged, I think, on a couple of different fronts. One, I think he was emotionally and physically exhausted. But two, he probably also was saying, all I've done for God, and now I'm running from my life. This isn't fair. There's something not right with this picture. So he sits under a juniper tree, cries out to God, and he says to God, God, kill me or let me die. Now, you could read this and it doesn't feel intense. And I hope, I won't hope anything. I just know the realities is there's people that get so discouraged that they don't want to live anymore. It's not so much that they want to kill themselves, that type of thing, but they're just saying, you know what? I'm ready to go home. I'm ready to move on with life. He's so discouraged, he's telling God, take me out. But then he falls asleep. The first good thing that he did, he allowed himself to go to sleep. So what causes this kind of depression? Typically when people are physically exhausted. So I tell my students, here are the warning signs. You haven't slept well for the last 2 weeks. You've got a low-grade fever and you're under a lot of stress. Not a good sign for emotional health. We don't know if he had a low-grade fever or not, but we definitely know he was physically exhausted because we're most vulnerable after great success. And we're most susceptible then to discouragement because we've had this incredible adrenaline rush. And it doesn't just slowly, it just dies, it collapses. Number 2, he was emotionally spent. He was weary in spirit for 3.5 years, waiting for the moment, and now it's over. The third thing was he was alone, and being alone is always dangerous. We see in the life of Jesus 2 events that are kind of the bookends of his ministry. Before he starts his ministry, he spends 40 days alone in the desert. And at the end of the 40 days, he is tempted. He is vulnerable. And yet Jesus gives to us what we need to do when during those times we need to be people of the word, because that's how he got through that. But the second time is when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he wants the disciples. He doesn't want to be alone, but he feels abandoned by the disciples because couldn't you just stay awake for 1 hour? Yeah, I'm about ready to do something which the disciples were clueless on what was happening next. And he just says, would you just stay awake and pray? And he goes back and they're sawing logs. You see the anguish of Jesus. Being alone can be very, very dangerous emotionally in our life. So Elijah fits the perfect example of someone who's prone to depression. And when that happens, we lose perspective. And all of a sudden, we forget about the great victory. We forget about what God has done in the past because all we can see is the difficulties of the present. When you and I lose perspective, That's not a good place to be, because we forget that God was faithful here, faithful there, faithful there, faithful there. And it's almost like it doesn't exist, because all we can see, we got tunnel vision. All we can see is the pain of the moment, the discouragement of the moment. And he forgets the victory. Elijah was not thinking clearly. So this is exactly what he said. It's enough now, O Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers. Let's pause there. What did Elijah mean with that last phrase, that I am no better than my fathers? This is kind of a tragic story, but Elijah knew his history. He had a Tony back there. I don't know who his Tony was, who taught him history there. He knew the history. And as he thinks about his fathers, he realized there have been moments and seasons and times when the people had rallied and done the right thing, but it didn't last. Or there have been moments when God had sent a prophet and the people rejected the words of the prophet. And so he was thinking that maybe this is going to be an exception to the rule, that maybe this is going to last. Maybe the people are really sincere, but he is so discouraged. He just says, I'm just like my fathers. They worked their whole lives trying to do something good. And what did it get them? Many times the death sentence. When you and I are discouraged, we totally lose perspective. And we become borderline irrational in our thought process. So there are two things that Elijah did. I'm all alone. There's no one else in the kingdom that's worshiping you or me. And two, I'm just like my fathers. They tried, and when he talking about his father, he's not talking about his earthly, he's talking about the spiritual giants of the land, the prophets that were before him, the Nathans of the world and others who tried to speak to the people, and the people rejected. He probably was going back to Joshua and his warnings before they went into 400 years of the dark ages during the period of the judges. So this guy really is in self-pity. I think we would all agree with that. Well, let's move on. Again, I'm the only one. He's drained. Now, let's see what God does in response to this terrible predicament that Elijah is finding himself in. First of all, God doesn't preach at him. I've said this many times here at the township, and I think it bears repeating. When people are going through a difficult time, they don't need sermons, they just need your presence. And a timely word may be spoken, but they don't need our sermons. They don't need a theology about why good people suffer. Even though that may be appropriate at some point, what they need is your presence. So God doesn't give them a sermon. He gives them two things. He goes to sleep and he gives them a good meal. This is in 1 Kings, I think, chapter 19. That's all God does. Doesn't say anything to him. Because after he's complaining about, I'm the only one, I'm ready to die, I'm ready to go, God, to take me, I'm ready to go. It says, and he fell into a deep sleep. Then when he woke up, he got a great meal. I have no idea what that great meal was, but think of the best meal you ever had. That's your meal. Because I tell my students, you need to keep up on your rest and you make sure you're eating well. Because you can't think yourself out of these despondent moments, these moments that get us so discouraged. The fact is, the more you think about it, the deeper, it's kind of like drilling. It goes deeper and deeper. I always say people who are not great thinkers and not very intellectual, they don't have a whole lot of depression. It's usually people who have great minds that have the depression. Why? It's because their thought process drives them, and they get themselves in a spiral, and they go down and down and down. And what do we need? Rest and a good meal or two. I love it. Once he wakes up, he tells them to go and travel. And he travels. He travels for days, and he finds a cave. Now, Elijah's not done with his self-pity yet. I think he's coming to life a little bit, but he's him and God still have some things to work out. And so God asked Elijah, he's in the cave, hiding by himself. It's had a good meal, so the stomach's full, had some rest, so he's thinking a little more clearly. God says, what are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah goes, what do you think I'm doing? I'm running for my life. Jezebel wants my head. What are you doing here, Elijah? And look at Elijah's response. I've been jealous for you, God, which is another way of saying, I've done everything you asked me to do. You are my focus. You are my life and everything else. I have a passion for you. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's what a jealous person for God looks like, that intense passion for God. But God asked the question, okay, so you love me, but what are you doing here? What are you doing here? I've worked hard. Elijah confused activity with a relationship. I think that happens a lot among Christians. As we think that if we do a lot for God, that's the same thing of being in good relationship with him. Now, please don't hear me saying we're not supposed to do kindness and do those things, but never confuse our activity with the relationship. My activity needs to come out of my relationship. It's not a substitute for my relationship. I must have that relationship with God. And so he says, I've been passionate. I teach school, I teach the Bible, I've raised my kids to, and you go through this long laundry list of things that we do as if that's what the relationship is all about. Never confuse activity or relationship. And of course, as I said before, he says, I fail. I'm no better than my fathers. The nation has not really changed. What did he do here? He confused about what defines success. In our Western world, we have this idea that it's go big or go home. Success is about how big we are or how much we do this and everything else. And what God has defines as success is us being faithful to what God asks us to do. Think about Jeremiah. How many people did he influence? But he was faithful, therefore he was successful. I love the fact that we have these great meetings where there are tens of thousands of people that hear the gospel and everything else. That's great. But there may be that poor pastor who's out in the middle of nowhere that's got 10 people in their congregation. And that person, if he's doing what God or she's doing what God's called them to do, is as faithful and successful as the person who's preaching to tens of thousands. He's called us to be faithful. Elijah was struggling a little bit here. Well, let's continue. What did he learn? He then takes them to the mouth of the cave. And he asks them again, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? Don't you get frustrated with instructors who ask the same question and you think you've answered it, but they ask it again, as if implying that what your answer was wrong? And sometimes they just want you to dig a little deeper. I tell my students that when you're doing brainstorming, come up with a minimum of 10 ideas. And they look at me like, 10 ideas, why 10? I says, the first 3 or 4 are the easy ones. They're the ones that ever come to everyone's mind. The last 3 or 4, you got to really have some wild ideas and creative ideas to come up with it. And it's there you find some of the novel ideas, the innovative ideas that actually can have a substantial impact on your organization. Okay, so Elijah's being asked, what are you doing here? He answers the question, what are you doing here? He answers the question, what are you doing here? Kind of reminds me of, do you love me? Of course you know, Lord, I love you. Do you love me? Lord, what are you doing? You know I love you. By the third one, I think Peter was pulling his hair out if he had any. Okay. Of course you know I love you. Feed my sheep, feed my lambs. What are you doing here? Then we see something that takes place. I'm going to tell you, I didn't, because it would have been a long passage. So then what happens is there is the wind that comes. And God says to Elijah, do I ever speak in the wind? Yeah, I have in the past, but am I speaking in the wind today? No. Then it brings the thunder. And that wind and thunder and fire are reminiscent of Mount Sinai when the children of Israel were before them. And God spoke out of that. But God was teaching Elijah something different. He says, yes, I spoke when that fire came down and consumed it. I spoke when the rain came, but you know what you need right now? You don't need thunder, lightning, and fire. You need that still, small place. See, Elijah knew the God of the sensational, who had brought fire down to consume a sacrifice, who had miraculously fed him at a brook and later at a widow's home. His idea of God was in the wind, earthquake, and fire, but he learned a valuable lesson in this interchange he had with God, that God also speaks, and I think many times more normally speaks, in a still, small voice, which sometimes we lose track of because we've got so many voices and so many distractions in our life. It's in the quiet place that we can best hear God. When I was youth pastor, we took high school students on a retreat up in the Adirondacks of New York. And we were there over a Sunday. We were there Friday nights, all day Saturday and Sunday morning. And for Sunday morning, we had our version of church. And it was a little chapel they had. And so we got there and we sang a couple choruses and someone brought a guitar. And I said, for the next hour, I want you to leave this facility and I want you to walk among the forest. No talking, just listening. I was back before cell phones could be a distraction. And so for 1 hour, all they had to hear was nature. And what I was hoping did happen is that God would speak something to their hearts during the time. So when we came back after the hour was up, I said, you probably didn't hear the voice of God. That's happens, but that's not necessarily normal. But God speaks to us in our thoughts. What thoughts did you have during this time? And as people began to share, you could hear God. It was amazing. And the students said, I had never been silent for 1 hour in my entire life. First time that ever happened. Hear from God. That's what Elijah was learning. Yes, you're running for your life. Trust me, I'll take care of you. I've got a plan for Jezebel. She's not going to harm you. But the fact is, God taught Elijah through this experience about the voice of God. The voice of God. And oh, by the way, there's a P.S. that when God finally did speak to Elijah, oh, by the way, you think you're all by yourself? There are 7,000 who have never bowed their knees to Baal. So when you and I think we're the only ones that are holding it together, God's got a people. They may number in the millions today, scattered all over this globe. You may feel like there have been times in your life you're surrounded, like, is there anyone here who really believes in God and understands the things of God? You feel like you're all by yourself. Elijah, there's 7,000. Duane, there are literally millions that are calling out my name every weekend in praise and worship in all different types of languages and dialects. God's got a people. Well, the schooling, and let me close with this slide. What does the mighty wind speak to me about? It speaks to me about activity. As I said before, God is about the relationship. There is a place for activity, but it must always come out of my relationship. Okay, God is not interested in how busy I am. He's interested in where my heart is in relationship to him. Because if I fill my calendar and doing all these good things, but I don't do it because out of God leading me and guiding me, and I'm spending time with him, then I think we've gotten too busy. Earthquake. To me, earthquake speaks of miracles. God is more concerned about me than my circumstances. Many times we focus on the miracle when God wants us to focus on him, on the God of miracles. I shared this with my students. There's a tremendous revival taking place in different parts of the world, even here in the United States. And so my students asked me the question earlier this week about what my thoughts were about all of this great revival that's taking place. Some of you may have heard about what's happening at Asbury, the Methodist school, and other places here. And there was a meeting this last week here in Springfield, where there were literally tens of thousands of people that came in from around the world into Springfield for the week-long series of events. And they were asking me what my thought was. And I says, first of all, I never want to be a critic of what God is doing. It may not be my cup of tea. It may not be, what I think, because I never want to put God in a box, because as soon as I put God in a box, he'll break my box. Right? That's the first thing. The second thing is that I believe that when God moves, it's a grace and it's a gift from God, but it's not there so you have an experience. It's there so that you are changed. And if after all that takes place, whether it's in Asbury or where it's at and around the world, if people are not different, then it was a wasted moment. It was a wasted moment. And just like now, I feel like if there's a pin drop, that's exactly what my classroom was like, because we were processing. So I says, here's what you do when you have those moments, because I've lived through that. I've lived long enough. I've seen waves of this take place, and I've seen God do a work. And what has broken my hearts in the past is people that tend to go back to their old ways. God's not interested in having miracles for miracles' sake. Miracles always point to something, should take us somewhere. They should not be the end of what God is doing. So the earthquakes speak something powerful to me in the day in which we live. See, God is greater than this manifestation. So that's what the mighty wind would be, a manifestation. The earthquake would be a manifestation. When you read in Acts chapter 2, those manifestations, those are God showing up in manifestations. And we can't spend our time focusing on the manifestation where, they happen, they're a God thing, but we must focus on the giver of the manifestation, not the manifestation itself. Okay. Because, as I said, spiritual experiences should always assist me in my growth and my walk with God. The fire represents his presence. And what happens many times is we try to recreate. Have you ever been in a service? I don't know how far back you need to go. I'm thinking back of a couple services where it's like you walked away and you said, wow, this was awesome. God was here. It was just a special moment. Maybe it was the song, maybe it was a prayer time, whatever. There was just an incredible experience. The next Sunday or the next service comes along, and if you don't have the same events take place, people say, where's God? Because they're associating God with those events, those manifestations. Sometimes God wants to speak in a still small voice. It's not always the loudest. Sometimes it's God wanting for us to be still. Be still. And so we need to be careful that we don't focus on the form of how God comes to our lives and interacts with us. In other words, have you ever had a good friend come and you speak something in your life and you say, wow, that was from God? Have you ever had someone you don't like speak into your life too? They're a little harder for us. God can use anyone. He can use a child to speak into our life. Say something that triggers and say, wow, that whether that child understood it or that person understood it, they just spoke something into my life. I hope as a preacher, pastor, there are times when that can be said. I say something that speaks something into someone's life. Okay. So I can't judge the environment. I can't recreate the environment. I can just be open to what God has for me. And he comes in the gentle whisper. We look for God in our busyness. We look for God in the miracles. We look for God in our feelings. And when they're not there the way we think they should be, we panic. When I can't see the fire, do I still believe? When the miracle does not come, do I become discouraged? When I feel like I'm being placed in the sidelines, and I know many of us as we get older feel like that's happening, do I feel worthless anymore? May the Lord help us to shape our thinking, to look at it from a different perspective today. That's what happened to Elijah. God gave him a great lesson through this whole experience as he stood at the mouth of the cave. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father, thank you that you come and interact with us in so many different ways. Sometimes it's through our reading of your word. Sometimes it's through some preacher, whether we watch it on TV or we actually are in person and able to hear something and they say something that just brings life, brings joy to our hearts. May we not be guilty of putting you in a box that you have to speak a certain way. You're God, I'm not. The day it comes, Lord, that when I put you in a box is the day, Lord, you bust the box. So give me eyes to see and ears to hear what you're saying and speaking into my life in so many different ways. For we ask it in Jesus' name. And everyone said, amen. God bless you all. Have a great, great day. And I promise you, of course, I already promised you the last 2 weeks, we will be done next week with Elijah. Hey, we'll look forward to seeing you next week. I do promise I'll be here. That's probably the one I can guarantee will happen. All right, God bless you all.